And welcome to another edition of the live stream of Feeding the Dragon. If you're joining us today, be sure to check out the podcast. If you miss any of the show on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you find good podcast at, Ryan Ray alongside, as always, the one, the only, the Dragon Feeder himself, Chris Fenton. How's it going, Chris?
Great. I would say you're the one and only Ryan Ray, too, of War Room Media. So we're in good hands with each other here. I'm excited to be on. There's always lots to talk about when it comes to China. And here's just another day in the world of the U.S. and China.
Yeah, and real quick, I think you had a couple announcements I want to get to before we get into the show about some stuff that you have coming up. So you want to go ahead and plug that real quick? Your speech, your article.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's a plug or not. I mean, I'm actually moderating my first panel tomorrow, which is fun. I've always been the bloviate, gregarious, talkative one. I guess now I got to listen to people, which is good. It's for the US-Asia Institute. It's called Bridging the Asia-Pacific for Young People panel. If you go on the US-Asia Institute website, you'll see it there. But we have Ree Zong from the Wilson Center on there, along with Wayne Morrison from the Congressional Research Center, the Congressional Research Service. The CRS obviously is the one that educates all congressional members on various topics. In fact, typically when a House rep or member of the Senate needs more information about something they need to speak intelligently of, they have their staff call over to the CRS and they say, hey, give us all the macro points we need to know so that we are super, super insightful on this various issue. So that's really fun. And I met Wayne actually when we co-hosted a delegation of senior staff members and some CRS members on the ground in Beijing. I think it was back in 2012. So I'm excited to do that tomorrow. I believe it's at 10 o'clock Pacific, 1 o'clock East Coast. And then also I'll be speaking at the National War College next week too, which will be unfortunately a private event, but I'm really excited to hear some new information on sort of where the Pentagon sees the potential Taiwanese conflict. And also I'd like to know a little bit more about Myanmar too. That's something that I think has just reared its head out of nowhere, and it creates a bit of a power vacuum in a very, very sort of precarious, sensitive area of the world right now. So, and of course, China's right there. So we got to be a little careful about that. And then one other thing I thought was interesting, I know they're replaying it, was that the Wilson Center's having their China Fellowship Conference today. I was listening to some of it this morning. I'll probably mention some of the tidbits I picked up during the show today.
Okay, and one quick plug from my end. The George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations has announced their senior fellows, and I sent out a link for that. So for those of you who don't know, I'm on the board of advisors, not a fellow, not nearly smart enough to be a fellow or a senior fellow, much less. But anyways, so I've sent that link out as well, so you can check out more from the Bush China Foundation as they release all of the various things that they have going on. Okay, so let's talk about the Lunar New Year. Now, just curious, Chris, have you been in China during the Lunar New Year? Have you experienced it? What's kind of your and real quick for those tuning in, see if you got people in. This is an open show for dialogue, so feel free to hop in with questions or comments at any point. I should have said that early on. My apologies. Lunar New Year, what have you experienced it? What's your take on it? Because we'll talk about some of the stuff we've seen in a second, though.
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. I mean, it's the largest migration of human beings on Earth at any given time. I think it outplaces, the journey to Mecca during that particular time of year in the Middle East. It's unbelievable. And a lot of the infrastructure that has been built all throughout China, including the high-speed rail and buses and all the highways, a lot of that caters to these particular couple weeks that tend to happen either in mid to late January or throughout February. This year, it's a little later than usual. My interaction with the Lunar New Year, the actual time that is a national holiday, I've never been there and I've never wanted to be there then. Traveling is really difficult. Things get super crowded. And it's not really a time where you can get any business done whatsoever because everything shuts down. So there was really never a reason for me to be there. Now, I will say we always had our New Year's party in Beijing a week before everybody shot off for the holiday, and it was always very difficult to get airline tickets in and out of there around then. You started to see people flee for the countryside. It was always a very sort of chaotic scene, even a week before the official start of the holiday. So yeah, it's something I've always wanted to avoid, and I'll continue to avoid, but it's really a marvel of a massive population and what they do, both in preparation and how they go off and do it. And quite frankly, for the movie business, which I'm a part of, it's arguably in that 2-week period, I don't know the exact stats, but they make a majority of the biggest grosses during that period. I mean, it's a major movie attendance time of year.
Yeah, and so from my standpoint, so we saw this was happening last year with coronavirus. Obviously, the COVID stuff had already kind of broken out, and so people were talking about this year. We've seen at the end of Q4 of 2020, people were talking about China was the only major economy to grow and all this stuff. Well, now you're starting to see, okay, well, here's Lunar New Year, the time where people should be out, should be traveling, should be moving. As you say, it's the largest migration of people. And if you look at the plane tickets, the hotel number prices, all of those are way off the mark, which makes me wonder how accurate some of those reports were about China GDP growth in 2020. Now, obviously, this is one indicator, but it is it tells you something about the freedom to move in China, and of course, all of those things are tied up with growth. Because if you're not moving around, you're not doing stuff, you're not trading, your GDP is just not going to grow as it normally would. So, how much weight would you put on what we're seeing? Because this is a real look at what's going on with Lunar New Year.
Yeah, that's a good question, because the New Year holiday period is really a mandated government holiday. So there is so much that's shut down anyway during that particular time of year. So you don't have the GDP growth that builds from manufacturing and factories operating, all that kind of stuff. What you do instead is you get that GDP effect by all these people traveling at once and using the airlines and using their cars and utilizing energy sources to get from point A to point B and buying gifts for their relatives and all that kind of stuff. What's interesting is when you lock it down and prevent people from doing it, it's still a holiday period. So you're actually going to have all that manufacturing and the factories shut down because the people are going to have their time off, but they're not going to be doing the migratory process that they usually do. So I do think it's going to create a bit of a dent. I don't know how big of one it's going to be overall. I mean, I'll let the economists figure that one out. On top of it, it's a little ambiguous exactly how hard the lockdown is. I was talking to somebody in Beijing last night, and he said that they're not really forcing people not to go back home, but they're definitely trying to persuade them not to, which is really difficult for a lot of these people that come into the cities to work the whole year, and then they have one time of year to actually go home and see their wife and kids, or see their kids, because a lot of times the wife and husband go off to different cities to work, and grandparents are taking care of their kids. And remember, none of these people were able to go back last year. So if they don't go back this year, it's going to be a full 3 years before they see any of their friends and family back home in these small villages that they all come from.
Yeah, and so that's kind of the question. Is one of the things we heard last year was a lot of talk about how the Chinese populace is good at saving money. They're good at storing up money, so they can kind of withstand these shutdowns maybe better than Americans can. But at some point, that pent up demand to get back home, to see your family, it's got to pop. And so you look at this and you go, okay, is it not popping because they're concerned, they're being persuaded, or is it not popping because they spent more of their saved up dollars than maybe we thought they would have? And so that would impact the Chinese economy moving forward.
Yeah. And I mean, we always talk about the government goal of keeping 1.4 billion people just happy enough that they don't revolt. And there's no better way to create discontent in the population by dividing, parents and children, and the ability for family to get together and gather. It's a really difficult and stressful thing to put on any family and put on any people. And to have that happen again 2 years in a row, I can't imagine it's making a lot of the lower class, which is a large part of the population there, very happy right now. And that's got to be a concern for the government.
Okay, let's talk now about a story that's getting a little bit of attention. I know you've been following pretty closely, but HNA. I got a little headline here from Reuters from January 31st. 3 listed units of China's HNA disclosed embezzlements of nearly 10 billion. That's with a B, $1 billion. Um, that's a lot of money. I don't care if it's in dollars or what it's in. 10 billion is a lot.
Yeah, it's another just story of fraud and graft and sort of an abuse of the system that is it's a capitalistic system with communist socialist characteristics, or however the Chinese government calls it. And remember, they're relatively new to this. I mean, they haven't really been in capitalism or any form of capitalism other than the last, maybe you could say 30 years. And really the last decade is when it really started to go ramping. And they have regulators, whether it's the CSRC or the PBOC and various others, that are supposed to keep an eye on this type of fraud, graft, abuse of the capitalistic system. And a lot of times they're following, what happens currently and trying to make up for it with punishments and catch up to it. And if you look at HNA, and I'm not going to get into the weeds on what actually is going on there, but I do remember several years ago, several private equity firms asking me about HNA. Is their money real? Are they really spending as much as they are? Do they have that financial wherewithal, et cetera? And honestly, all I knew about them was that they were the parent company of Hainan Airlines. That was about it. And it was interesting to see all the assets they were buying throughout the world, and in particular in the US. And now you look at the financials that they have been reporting and what the debt market and creditors are trying to clean up. They have liabilities apparently, and this is after they shed a lot of assets to raise capital. Apparently, their liabilities that they can't pay off are over $100 billion US, which is a massive amount of money. I mean, there's not a lot of companies on earth worth that much, and that's what their liabilities are. And then to just see shareholders run off and embezzle 10 billion on top of that is really unbelievable. So this is something that the CCP has to take very careful attention on and figure out how to fix, because not only did we see with the GameStop issue, a lot of netizens in China find solidarity between the little fish and the big fish combat, and when it comes to capital markets and publicly traded companies. But we're also seeing the little guys feel like they're getting taken advantage of in all other areas of this form of capitalism. And this is something the government's got to say, hey, look, we're looking out for you, 1.3 billion people. Let's assume 100 million are really taking advantage of it. There's 1.3 billion that are getting sort of thrown out with the bathwater. They need to pay attention to this, figure out how to regulate it. And I think we're starting to see some of that with even the clampdown on things like Ant Financial, where the government's going, wait a minute, how big is Ant Financial going to be? How influential is it going to be? What happens if something goes wrong there? What happens if there's corruption inside the company or fraud or malicious behavior? They need to start thinking about that, because the ramifications of these things blowing up or things going wrong affects a large part of their populace. And those are the people that they got to keep just happy enough to avoid another June 4, 1989.
Yeah, so I've long held this kind of belief, whether it's USChina or Somalia, South Africa, insert 2 countries here. If Ryan Ray in America can invest in insert country here, I am now more concerned about what happens in that country. Now, you might say that's, cold or whatever. It's just factual. So if I can invest in China or Somalia or wherever, and I feel like it's safe, I'm concerned. Hey, the U.S. wants to go bomb? Hold up. I've got investments in that refinery. Don't do that. If you want to tariff them, hold up. You're hurting my business. So from the Chinese standpoint, for them to make sure that their businesses are running ethically and, on the up and up, and allowing U.S. investors to invest in those companies will help U.S.-China relations. The inverse is also true. If U.S. investors and pension funds start losing money, they won't care what our politicians do to China. They won't care if we talk about decoupling or Cold War, because they're going to say, listen, these guys are screwing us over. And so this is an issue that can actually bring us together if we can feel safe to invest, because the average person might not care about China, but if they can start investing, make a little money in the stock market, their retirement portfolio, all of a sudden you really care about what's going on. And so it sounds like a cold way to do geopolitics, but it's just factual. You start caring about the people you do business with. So I agree that the implications are important, and they could be even more important if we can get the kind of corruption out of the system on both sides.
Well, and corruption on the system on both sides is so crucial too, because every time that we have something go awry in our capital markets or in our economic system, the government uses that to its advantage in China, right? Like the CCP loves when we foul things up or do things that obviously hurt the little guy or become a great story for them to say, hey, look, democracy is not all that good. In fact, their form of free capitalism is not all that free, and it's pretty terrible too. So, even this GameStop thing, which the netizens were talking about a lot over there, there's been a lot of commentary from the CCP side on it, and the fact that we have a broken financial system or whatever it is, that dates back even back to 2008, as far as I've been paying attention, where they literally blamed the subprime mortgage crisis on the United States of America that seeped throughout the world, COVID-like, quite frankly. And in fact, I've noticed some of these Global Times COVID articles, I got to pull one up, where they actually compare the financial crisis of 2008 as a disease or as a virus that started in the US and spread across the world. So we should talk, like that kind of a thing. So they love when this stuff goes awry in the US. And the more we can actually try to keep our shit together and make it work here, the harder it is for them to use that stuff to please their populace and say, hey, look, communism is the right form of government for you.
Okay, let's move now to a topic we haven't discussed. I don't know if we discussed on this podcast. Maybe we have. I can't remember. Huawei. And so yesterday, the Committee on Homeland Security for the U.S. House of Representatives sent a memo, note, whatever you call it, to Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor. And I won't read the whole thing. I will read this quick portion, and I'll just summarize it. It basically says, "Hey, we want to know what you're going to do about Huawei and all of the other things involved with Chinese spying and stuff like that." It is signed by, I guess, all the members of this particular committee, and it's kind of the first time we're seeing maybe the Biden administration being pushed from Congress to say, okay, because they reference in the approval process, the cabinet said, well, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. The House committee is saying, we want to know exactly what you're going to do. We would need to hear a plan detailed. On some level, this is probably a little bit of posturing going on, but it might push the Biden administration to answer some of these questions, especially around Huawei, which is, I think, if we're being honest, it is a security threat to any country who takes this on. If you allow Huawei into your country, the 5G, you are opening yourself up to the Chinese spying on you. What do you expect the Biden administration is going to say or do about the Huawei issue?
Yeah, you know what, and maybe this is a guest that we bring on the show or something, but I'm actually completely perplexed at the other side of this argument, right? Like I get the security concern. I get the fact that, look, China built its own World Wide Web. They built their own, GPS navigation systems. They're trying to get completely independent on microchip level. And quite frankly, we should let them have their own 5G network, because do we really want to be a part of theirs? That makes no sense to me, right? And I don't understand the other side of the argument as to why there's anybody pushing back on us pushing Huawei out of this nation in every capacity. I just don't, where is that coming from? Is it lobbyists, and who's making money off of the Huawei interaction here in the US? And have we outed those conflicts of interest? I haven't seen exactly where the pushback's coming from. And to me, I don't fully comprehend it.
Yeah. So when I was in China, we met with a former CIA guy at some deal, and we talk about Huawei, and it's the greatest threat, and da da da. And someone asked him, I don't know if it's me or someone else, but anyways, someone asked him, well, what's different about Huawei versus what the CIA is doing? And I loved his answer. His answer was, Snowden was the greatest, has ruined our basically ability to spy on people. And he was like legit upset at Snowden for exposing that we were doing the same thing that Huawei's doing. So I do wonder how much of that is tied up with this argument where the U.S. government wants to be careful how they say it, because they could be accused of doing the same thing. It's no secret that they've spied on their own citizens. So I wonder if that's kind of it. They're kind of hedging their bets. Well, if we go too hard on Huawei, the Chinese might expose more of our surveillance programs, because obviously we're spying on China, we're spying on people all over the world. So I've wondered if that's kind of in the background there.
Yeah, but I think, the Chinese government, there's no reciprocity on sort of the access we give Huawei to the United States in regards to something that's similarly as like jeopardizing on a security level to the Chinese. It's sort of like we have China Daily over here in the Global Times, but you can't like buy the New York Times in the middle of, you know, downtown Beijing or whatever. The reciprocity is not there. So I don't really know why we should be all that concerned about China retaliating for us throwing Huawei out. I think the CIA has been pretty out, and most people know what they're up to out there. I mean, if China really can expose us in every other country in some sort of way, then we have bigger fish to fry. And then that means they have some sort of blackmail over us anyway. So we should just get that out in the open, just like Snowden did, so we don't have them with that leverage that could be a real national security concern. So there must be a major, and maybe I'm completely naive, but there must be a major money involvement in Huawei that overcomes all of this national security concern, with thousands of lobbyists pummeling anybody that wants to fully kick them out.
Well, yeah, just to be clear, the CIA's frustration, this guy's frustration is that we were spying on our allies, and that Snowden, when he revealed everything, he broke that loose. And so and he was frustrated that we couldn't do that anymore in secrecy. It's like, that's a weird thing to be frustrated about, but you know, and of course our own citizens. So I agree, but you know, I was watching yesterday the press conference, and they asked about the Russian guy Navalny, and they said, what, you know, what does the Biden administration think about this? And they read some canned speech like, this is very bad, there's a constitution. And if you listen to it, they didn't say anything. And this is typical diplomacy, is that you don't say anything. Whereas we're all sitting here going, well, yeah, you know, Russia's going to do what Russia's going to do. Putin's going to put down his, you know, his critics. And so I found that when you listen to some of the rhetoric, whether it's the Trump administration or Biden administration or whoever, the official statements are very weird to folks like me and you, because to me, it's a no-brainer. Like, hey, if they're going to spy on us, I don't want them spying on us, nor do I want the CIA spying on us. I don't want anybody spying on me. So, yeah, let's just keep that out of here. And the way they handle it makes me wonder, why do they handle it the way they do? And the only thing I can figure, and I could be off, is that they just don't want to be mud thrown back at them, so they try to handle it tactfully. But I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me either.
Yeah, I mean, there's got to be. I think there's got to be a financial situation to it. I mean, I don't see how else this plays, and maybe we should do a little more diligence on this ourselves and figure it out so we can talk about it on the show a little better. But I mean, the big mystery to me is, why is there so much throwback on stuff that we know is obviously a national security concern and something we need to move out of this country, and something, quite frankly, that we need to address as a country, which is building our own 5G network, one that's contained and secure, and something we can use with the Western allies and other countries that we have good relationships with, because having the pipes and the device and everything together in one particular package does allow for a lot of potentially nefarious behavior, for sure, by people that aren't necessarily our allies. And, you know, it's a point of infrastructure that we have to think about doing ourselves. And I know there's all kinds of different plans, and I know it's super expensive, but we need to get serious about that. And it's just one example of this stuff that we need to decouple from China on.
Okay, and final thing, or one of the final things is, I saw you sent this out from TechCrunch. China launched its national carbon trading market yesterday, and it talks about, you know, how this could be, if it's done right, how this could be, you know, a mitigation against climate change and this, that, and the other. A couple things that stand out to me. One is when I was in China, they talked about their nuclear program maybe by 2030 kind of being rolled out in mass. That would be a big step in the right direction. Two, if you go look at the satellite data from last year when they were in the massive lockdown, and you look at kind of the before and after, like the smog levels, you know, they're going away. I think we have to be realistic that China, whatever they roll out, is not necessarily going to end their pollution problem today, tomorrow, next year, next decade, probably, barring a mass transformation. But my concern is, as someone who's worked in the energy industry for some time now, a lot of the carbon swapping, carbon trading stuff is not really what people think it is. So we did a show on this a while back, but you know, essentially, there's three ways in the U.S. to get carbon tax credits, right? So one is mitigation. So you say, call up Chris Fenton, Chris, hey, I've got X amount of carbon. and you're like, okay, well, I'm gonna plant trees or whatever the mitigation is, and so we do a swap. So you go plant trees. I'm still putting it out there, but we're doing a 1-to-1. Another way is that we take it and we store it back in the earth. Now that's very expensive. It's very time consuming, and it's very hard to do. And so most companies don't do that because it's just a lost leader. And the third way, off the top of my head, I'm trying to think of what the third way was. I can't remember what it was. There's basically 3 ways. So when you look at that, you say, well, if we're planting trees for carbon pollution, I don't know, how many trees are you going to plant in China? So you start getting into these things, and I think that a lot of people maybe kind of get rosy-eyed about what's going on with China, their history of cheating and stuff like this. I would say whatever they're doing, we should probably look at it as more of a outward kind of saving face type thing than it is anything else. Are you very optimistic about their climate goals, the carbon neutrality? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't know if it goes right into the carbon issue also has the climate change issue, and it's also a CO2 issue. And quite frankly, CO2 by itself isn't really a noticeable pollutant, right? Like it's noticeable by, I guess, people that say that the climate is changing, but it's not noticeable to the populace, right? And if you look at China, some of their biggest directives have to do with things that people notice are terrible, right? So if you're in Beijing, and I remember the Iron Man 3 premiere we had, I think the ppm mark that night was over 800, which if you've ever been in an 800 ppm environment, it's essentially like being in a garage that you've had a car running in for, I don't know, a few hours. It's terrible. And by a couple hours later, you feel like you have strep throat. It leaves this terrible sort of like pain, irritation in the back of your throat. It's brutal, and it makes your eye, you got to wear sunglasses or glasses because your eyes get all burny. That stuff makes people upset. Like it makes them really pissed off. And in fact, when they have schools that have kids out on recess and all that kind of stuff, when those bad pollutant days happen, they lock them all inside. They can't go outside and play. And they also tell everybody to stay indoors throughout all those days. Now, LA has days where they recommend that. It's very, it's very limited how many days that happens. And our hazardous days, I think, are anything over like 125 ppm. They're not like over 700 ppm or whatever it is. So you have this, this obvious pollution problem that people of all walks of life can sense and get mad about. And in fact, one of the biggest things that happened a few years ago was this rumor that the Politburo, the Communist Party, and National People's Congress and various other branches of central government were going to relocate from Beijing to another part of China. And the reason for that was because the pollution got so bad there. And the people living in Beijing that can't just leave and move somewhere else were like, screw you. What are you doing? No, you can't. That's so elitist. Like, oh, it stinks here for us, but we can move somewhere else and we're just going to leave everybody else behind in this cesspool of pollution. So the outcry was so big by those rumors that the central government realized they couldn't just leave Beijing and go somewhere else. So they initiated this massive campaign of silver nitrating the clouds, which I actually believe does work and is creating rain there, because the foliage that I'm seeing in Beijing, at least on my last recent trip, was way different than stuff I've seen there before. On top of it, there's a lot of waterways that have plenty of water in them, which is strange to see. And then on top of it, the air is way cleaner than I ever remember the cleanest days like 10, 15 years ago. So a lot of that was localized moving of manufacturing, moving of coal burning facilities, trying to mitigate the amount of traffic on the road by putting in better public transportation infrastructure. The rain obviously helps too. And to date, Beijing is a much cleaner environmental city. Now, all they did was just move the smokestacks to other areas of the country. So the question is can they do it on a full nationwide level? And can that also translate to something more globally? Or are they just going to move all the smokestacks down to Southeast Asia, right? I mean, because that's the big argument I give my friends with Teslas. And they're like, oh, I'm so environmentally conscious. I'm like, well, what powers your car is coal and fossil fuels. No, it doesn't. It's an electric car. I'm like, the electricity you're getting in your wall is coming from a coal burning plant, right? Like you're just essentially a car with this really high smokestack so that everybody around you doesn't get the smoke from your, your combustion engine, but it goes somewhere else, wherever that factory is. So I'm curious to see if China can do this on a massive scale. I will say one of the great silver linings of China having this pollution problem is that they're able to plan long-term in the future and can initiate major renewable sources of energy, things that aren't pollutant, into their infrastructure that gives them a power grid and all that kind of stuff, because they have to do that to keep an uprising from occurring. So maybe that all plays into relative silver linings in something that doesn't look very good at the moment. So I don't know if that answers your question in full, but they have a problem mainly because they got to keep people from getting pissed off, and bad pollution is a good way to get people pissed off.
Yeah, that's a great point. So according to this, there's 46 nuclear reactors in China with 11 under capacity. And so hopefully they'll get those on. The more of that they get on, then they'll fix a lot of the problems that you talked about. Because if you move the coal plant, and that's kind of my point with all this stuff, is that you say, well, we got this plan. It's like, well, the plan just moved it from here to there. It's like, okay, well, now that plant. And so the other thing I would just say to anyone who's big on the EVs or solar batteries is just go look up what it takes to mine a battery and what they have to do to mine the destruction of the land there, and then how they store them. And we can talk about environmental friendliness at that point.
By the way, just really quick, nuclear, which on the surface seems great. The problem is how do you store all that radioactive material for thousands of years properly? And then on top of it, if there's one thing COVID has shown, is that the chain of command from very local all the way up to central is really, really insecure about their standing among the people above them. So I actually get really nervous about the idea of nuclear power in China, because heaven forbid something goes wrong and there's a radioactive leak. One thing about nuclear radioactive leaks is that you don't really know they're happening unless somebody tells you, right? I mean, 3 years down the road when all your people died from weird cancers or whatever, but right. You don't really know. And it's something that government officials would probably be very good at covering up to cover their own ass and then getting out of Dodge. And that makes me really nervous, because we looked at COVID and we saw the way they covered up something like that. I get really nervous about the slow motion train wreck that nuclear radioactivity can create in any sort of leak.
That's an interesting thought. I haven't thought about it in that perspective. I would submit that if they tried to cover that up, that would be, I think the COVID thing you can cover up a little bit easier, because Bob's walking down the street and he's coughing and he gets sick. Okay, does he have COVID? Does he have the flu? Does he have pneumonia? It's very hard for me or you to look at someone and say they have COVID or not. Radiation poisoning on mass scale, that's going to be harder to cover up. Obviously, I'm not wishing that on anybody. That'd be terrible. But I do see your point. It would be interesting to see how they handle that. I'm saying from an environmental protection standpoint, nuclear is the no-brainer, as it can last. The plants here in the U.S. get a 40-year starting permit with a 20-year extension, so they go 60 years. They could go a lot longer than that, of course. But anyways, so yeah, I think the nuclear thing is the no-brainer. I think you make an interesting point, though, to consider, is that they could have a meltdown, and not a meltdown, but a leak, and have problems. I don't think the storage stuff are nearly as big of issues as maybe some think they are, but that's a show for another day. Okay, Mr. Fenton, any final things before we get out here today? You're muted. You're muted.
Oh, I'm muted. But that's good, because usually I'm talking too much. I think one thing that we should all keep an eye on is Myanmar. I just think that's an interesting vacuum of leadership that's just occurred in China's sphere of influence. So, it could add further complication to the Taiwan situation too. So let's keep an eye on that. The China microchip story, I think, continues to be very interesting, and that plays into the Huawei topic that we talked about earlier. It will be interesting to see over the next couple of weeks. I mean, we're not in the thick of Chinese New Year, but we did talk about that lockdown and how that does affect China and the morale and national excitement around the populace in China if they can't go home again. It's also really going to state, as we mentioned earlier, the insecurity of having COVID under control. I mean, if they really do lock down people from being able to mobilize around the country, that's not a great sign. And obviously, we know they have problems with the vaccine and its effectiveness and so on and so forth. So lots of things to keep an eye on. I also am going to be watching that BBC video that Ryan and I were talking offline about with in regards to the Uyghur population and some of the atrocities that have just been revealed. I'm curious if others have seen that, but I want to check that out. And outside of that, just stay healthy and happy and keep talking about the China topic, because it's super important for all of us to keep it in the public discourse.
And with that reminder, you can find this show, if you miss any of it, on your favorite podcast application. And with that, we'll talk to you next time.